All right, we're on go. uh, let's do a little bit of review before we jump in. We hadn't done any yet, and that's usually not my practice. I try to get a lot of review in, but I've had so much material to cover that I hadn't done that. But a lot of the first part of Genesis, that's where we're going to spend most of our time because that's the meat of it, right? Genesis 1 through 6 is a whole nother world. We live in a different world than what was before Genesis chapter 6, in the sense that you might say that the world was recreated, or at least reformed. And we'll talk about that a little bit more tonight. Who is the author of the book of Genesis?
Moses.
Right. You'll find some conflict on that. Not so much about the book of Genesis, but Moses is attributed with writing Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And some of the higher critics, whose purpose, it seems their sole purpose, is to destroy the credibility of the Bible, want us to think that this is a compilation of many documents, some of it stories that people have told, maybe having a kernel of truth to it, but it's just an embellished legend or embellished story. And so we can't really trust that any of the things that we have here in Genesis or the rest of it as being accurate. It's just Hebrew tales. And if I don't get anything else done in the class, I hope to at least assure you that there is abundance of evidence out there that help us know and that Moses is the author of this. These are not tales. This is fiction. This is history that God has written, and he's written it for a reason. I'll ask about that in a moment. But Moses is the author. The only questionable passage in the book of the law, which would be the 5 books, the Pentateuch, would be there at the end of Deuteronomy where it speaks about the death of Moses. Of course, Moses couldn't have written about his own death. So probably that was edited by Joshua or a later scribe. But that doesn't take away from the inspiration of it. God gave that information for us, even if it didn't come from the pen of Moses. But Moses wrote these books. Another question is, to whom was this book, Genesis, as well as the succeeding 4, to whom was it written?
For the Jews coming out of Egypt.
That's exactly right. That's the right answer. The Jews, not just the Jews, but the Jews coming out of Egypt. Why did these people in particular need to know the information that's given in these books? Is this just a bunch of Jewish historical information that's randomly given? Or is there a purpose behind this? Why do these people need to know this?
Because they was under the influence of the Egyptian nation. So they had seen so much like witchcraft and different pagan mythology. Moses needed to make a point that it was the Lord that brought them through and nothing else. If you can't depend on anything else, you can depend on God. No matter how difficult the circumstance is, no matter what the circumstance is, God can bring you through it.
I don't know if you got that from me or you got that from somebody else, but you're spot on, man.
I got that from you, Mike.
Well, thank you. That's exactly right. These people had been under the influence of evil for 400 years. Not to mention that even some of the stars of the show that we'll get into as we start talking about Abraham, he had been under the influence of paganism for his whole life before God called him. And then even after God called him, we'll find idolatry popping up in his family over the next 2 or 3 generations. It wasn't as rampant as it became at some points, but Jacob's wives, when he brought them out of or got married to them and got them away from Laban, his father-in-law. Do you remember? We'll talk about it in another lesson, but do you remember what they did? One of the wives did?
They stole jewelry. I think she stole jewelry or something
Well,
of the
it wasn't
nature.
jewelry. It was his idols.
Mm.
They stole Laban's idols. And why would they steal Laban's idols? It wasn't to sell them necessarily. It was because they still had some kind of allegiance to that idolatry. The process of these patriarchs becoming faithful is a lot like ours. They were called out of something, and there's a transformation process that takes place in their lives, and it took them a while to get over some of the things that they came out of. And that's not just with them. Like I said, it's with us. Paul talked about it in the book of Ephesians to the church there. He says, some of you were idolaters, and he continues to talk about don't be idolaters. He told the same thing to the Corinthians. So these Corinthian Christians and Ephesian Christians and Colossians Christians, yes, they were Christians, but they were coming out of something, and a lot of those things had not yet worked themselves completely out. The transformation process was ongoing, and so it is with us. We may not bow down to idols because we didn't come out of idolatry, but we still fight with and struggle with things that we have learned under the influence of the world. And Moses wrote this book of Genesis to these people to help them understand where they came from and what they need to come out of in order to be like the one that has called them or who has rescued them from Egyptian slavery, but not only slavery, Egyptian idolatry. Paganism, as you pointed out, had become most likely a way of life for many of them. They had gotten so far away from God over the centuries, over the generations. There were some who were worshipers of God. I believe that could be a case could be made that Moses' parents, Amram and Jochebed, were worshipers of God. But I think a lot of them had, when we start looking at them, and well, we won't do that in the book of Genesis, but when we start watching them in the book of Exodus and Numbers, we'll see that they had pagan tendencies that went back to Egypt. And Moses is trying to get that worked out of them. You came from God, and he wants to introduce that God to them. They're going to be in a desert with God for some 40 years. At the time Moses is writing this, the time about which Moses is writing, of course, that had not taken place, but Moses is writing during that 40-year time, and the pronouncement that they were going to be there for 40 years had already been made. It was a disciplinary measure for them not believing what Moses had already told them and what God had already shown them. So they need to learn God. They need to learn the one true and living God who is the creator of all. And that's why he goes into the creation. That's the only reason that we really have the creation story. The creation story is not to defeat the evolutionists. The evolutionists defeat themselves with the arguments they make. The creation story does defeat the arguments of the evolutionists, or at least it shows us a different, I use the word paradigm because that's what the word was used in the film that we watched. But it gives them a choice now that they can believe they came from chaos, they can believe they came from these non-living deities, or they can believe they came from God. And you and I can believe that we came from apes and that we came from some accident of nature, or we can believe that we came from God. And so, yes, it's written for them, to them, but there's also application for us and need for us. Paul, as we know, wrote in Romans 15 and verse 4 that the old scriptures were written for our learning, not just for theirs. These people to whom Moses was writing are living somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 years away from the creation, away from the flood. They didn't witness these things, so Moses is giving them witness to it. Peter does the same thing for us. We talked about that in the book of 2 Peter, that the world has not always been like it is now, and the world will not always be like it is now. Just as there was a pre-flood world, and that world was judged and ended, so our world will be judged and ended. But there are skeptics in Peter's time as well as in ours saying, we've been trotting around here for 4,000 years. Nothing like that's ever happened. We have never seen it. And Peter says, you just wait. There's coming a time when the Lord will return again, and all this will be destroyed. All this will be melted with fervent heat. So God wants them to know why things are like they are. Things are dark. Things are evil. And there's a reason for that. And that's the point of the creation story. That's the point of the Adam and Eve story, the Cain and Abel story, and the Noah story, and all that in between. Those 6 chapters cover around 2,000 to 4,000 years. That's a lot of time, because the book of Isaiah, as big as it is, only covers a few years. It does have prophecy about the coming Christ. Same thing with Daniel. It only covers a few years in the chapters that he has. But here in Genesis, in the first 6 chapters, we're covering as little as 2,000, as much as 4,000 years. And God wants them to know why the situation is as it is. He wants them to know that sin has consequences, or there is consequence to sin. And here's an illustration. Let me show you what happens when sin comes into the world, when you allow sin to overcome you. Cain was told, you have the ability to overcome. It crouches at the door. It waits to destroy you, but you have the ability to overcome. And when you don't, there is consequence. And he received his consequence. The children of Israel, as they live under the supervision of God, under the sovereignty of God over the next 40 years, well, not just the next 40 years, but for the duration until the end of time, they needed to know, as they were starting out, that God does not only judge evil, but he saves those who come to them. And so we find in the Genesis 6 story, as well as, well, we see it in Genesis 3, we see it in Genesis 4, we see it in Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9 in the Noahic story. God judges evil. It cannot be continue to grow without being stopped at some point, and God judges it. But at the same time, he provides salvation for those who will come to him. Well, good answer. But when we look at the think about a test at the end of the semester, remember that answer that you gave. I think it was spot on. Remember some of the reasons that you listed, and some of these others that this is why God wanted them to have this information. It's not just Hebrew tales. Let me tell you a story about Noah. Let me tell you a story about Adam. It's not that. There's purpose here. There's reason why God puts ink to the page here. In how many days did God create the world?
6.
That's exactly right. Most people say 7. But he created the world in 6 days. He rested on the 7th day because he was tired, right?
No, sir.
No, he wasn't tired. He ceased his labor. That's all that word rested means. He ceased what he was doing. He was done with creation. He's going to manipulate the creation from time to time, but I can't think right offhand that God ever created anything else outside of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2 is a recap of Genesis chapter 1, a certain segment of it. So that's right, 6 days. And what was God's very best creation? What was the thing he said was very good?
That will be man in his image.
That's right. God created man. Everything else is for the purpose of man. God created the Garden of Eden, he didn't create, he had already created the garden, but he dressed the garden. He made the garden as a present. Here, I want to give this to you. You're my most special creation. Here, I want you to have this beautiful garden to tend and to keep. So man is the very best of God's creation. You already answered my next question. I was going to ask what was special about man, and you said that he was created in the image of God. What does it mean to be an image bearer of God? How do you understand that?
We are to love like God. We are supposed to represent God here on earth.
That's the word, represent. We are the image bearers of God. When the world looks in our mirror, so to speak, they should be able to see what God looks like. And we're not talking about, does he have blue eyes or black hair or a beard or a long nose or anything like that. We're talking, just as you mentioned, love. We discussed, I think we didn't we go to Exodus chapter 34 and talk about the characteristics of God? Did we do that?
We did.
Okay.
Long suffering.
That's right.
Meek.
Those are the characteristics of God, not the only characteristics of God. In fact, God told Moses, I can't show you everything. You're not ready for it yet. I think you and I have seen everything. We have seen God in the face of Jesus. We know what God is like now. He's the one who has demonstrated his love in a way that no one else would. He gave his only begotten son for sinners, not just for good people, not just for Americans who are his fellow patriots. He gave his only begotten son. His love was of such depth, or is of such depth, that he gave his only begotten son for the lostest of the lostest of the lostest sinners. And that absolutely does away with Calvinism. I don't care what anybody says. I don't know if you know what Calvinism is, but Calvinism says that some are lost and they're damned and there's nothing that can be done about it. And some are saved and they're going to be saved and there's nothing that can be done about it. It sounds so ridiculous to me when I hear that. I just wonder, how can a reasonable mind, and no insult to you if you believe this, but no insult intended anyway, I just cannot understand how someone could accept this belief that a God of love creates a person to be damned. And that person has no choice in the matter, and he can't escape that. If you were, according to the doctrine, predestined to be damned, then you're predestined to be damned, and there's no amount of baptisms, church services, or little old ladies to help across the street that you can do to be saved. You're just done. And that sounds like a horrific God. I mean, who would worship that? Even if he does save a segment, a certain segment of society, it's unjust or unjust to say that I created you to be damned and I created you to be saved. Those of you who are saved, you can't do anything to be damned. And those of you who are damned, you can't do anything to be saved. It's just an absurd doctrine. And to me, it's blasphemous of our holy God. Image bearer of God, you're exactly right. We are representatives of God, and you need to know that every step you take, every place you go, every sermon you preach, every child you rear, every neighbor you speak to, you are the image bearer of God, and they need to see that. When someone is hurting, you help. That's what God does. When someone is needing love, you love them. That's what God does. When someone is needing disciplined, you discipline them within your sphere of authority to do so, but you discipline them because that's what God does. He told us in the book of Deuteronomy, speaking to these same people, he says, a father chastises his son. Does he love his son? Of course he does. Why does he chastise him? Because he loves him. Well, God chastises us from time to time because he needs to correct some ill behavior in us. What command did God give Adam and Eve, and why?
To work the land.
That's one of the commands. You're exactly right. They're to dress and keep the garden. He gave them this beautiful present. Take care of it. What else did he give them?
Not to eat of the tree of life.
Not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They could eat of the tree of life.
Okay.
Two separate trees. One they were allowed to and encouraged to eat from. One they were discouraged. Well, they were commanded not to eat from it. For in the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. So why did God do that? Why would he put that there and say, no, don't do that. Don't eat that. Here, look at it, see it, be around it, but don't eat it. What was the purpose there?
Give you choices.
I think that's right. He wanted to give us a choice. He didn't want you to serve him, or Adam and Eve to serve him, or us to serve him because you have to. He didn't create robots that had no choice whether or not to serve God. He didn't put us in a situation where you only had good choices to make. That wouldn't be a choice. That's just, you only can do that because that's all you have to do. So he put it out there that I want to know, will you obey me no matter what? Will you trust me that when I say don't eat of this tree, will you trust me? And it is absolutely a violation of trust when God says, if you don't understand why God says don't eat of the tree, it doesn't matter really. The point is God said don't eat of the tree. That's all that needs to be said. Do you believe that God is sovereign? And if you believe that God is sovereign, do you trust him? He says, don't eat of the tree, you'll have life. You'll have life eternal. You'll have life with me. That's what I want for you. But if you make another choice, it brings judgment, it brings sin, and in the words of God, it brings death. But they didn't die. Adam lived for 900 and something years. So what's the deal there?
Spiritual death.
Spiritual death. Can you be more specific on that? Can you help me understand what that means, spiritual?
When they ate of the fruit, the relationship, the bond that they had with God wasn't as close. They separated
It was severed.
themselves
You're
from
exactly right. And it was not only as close, not as close, it was absolutely severed. God is love. God is life. And if we are not a part of God, we are neither love nor have life. And so that's what I think he meant. Death came into existence in a lot of ways because of Adam and Eve's sin. But I think the primary thing that we need to take from that is that there was a spiritual death, just as you said, and that spiritual death is defined as you're no longer a part of the fellowship of God. And if you don't have fellowship with God, your only other option is death. Life or death are the only two choices. They had physical life and would have for another 900 years before their bodies actually died. But if they did not restore that relationship that was broken or that was dead or died, the day that they chose to eat of that fruit, then their souls would have been eternally damned. God gave them a way to make amends there. The Bible doesn't go so much into the detail of that in Genesis, with specifically speaking of Adam and Eve, but we find that in all other cases, God made a way for them to continue to have life, or at least come back to him until the time that Christ would come, and then life would be restored completely. Who sinned first?
Eve.
That's the typical answer that we give, that Eve sinned first because she's the first one who listened to Satan.
Well, would you say because Adam did not correct her when she took the bite of it because he's supposed to had corrected her?
He should have kept her from the tree. He was the one who was given authority over her. It was his responsibility to teach her. There's no indication that God spoke to Eve. I'm not saying he did not, but the actual text says that God told Adam not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that command should have been carried forth to Eve, and I think that was Adam's responsibility. He had responsibility over the woman. He is not superior to the woman just simply by means or the matter of the fact that he was created first. He was the one given the authority over the other. Paul makes a argument about that when we get to the book of 1 Timothy. And
Let me ask you something, Mike.
Sure.
Because in the text, she repeated it back to Satan that she knew the command. Wouldn't she be at dire fault? Because, well, even though Adam was still there, he could have still, I guess, actually he should have been talking to Satan, being the head of his household.
Satan's head off.
Yeah, he should have been talking to Satan, but she knew it because she repeated back to Satan. She knew what God wanted.
Well, the thing is, she didn't actually repeat what God had said. She modified what God had said. I listened to a lesson on this a couple of weeks ago, and I need to bring that. I hate to go back and rehash this, and I won't do it tonight without further study. But I was listening to a teacher a couple of weeks ago who just broke down piece by piece Eve's answer, and I was surprised at how much, I thought, she just missed, she just added to the text by saying that you shall not touch it lest you die, because God only said you shall not eat it. And maybe if I can remember to do that, I'll review that for next week, and we'll backtrack a little bit. But I'd like to give you some more ideas, some more depth on that about exactly what Eve did there and how bad her conversation with Satan went. I was going to try to look at it right now, but I'm not going to be able to focus on doing that and doing this too. So I know we're going slow, and that's going to make us slow up a little bit more if I do that, but I think I'd like to study that a little further and present that to you to see just how far Eve's answer was off. Not only that particular answer, but the whole scenario was off. And I'll just hold my comments right there, and I'll look at that this week and try to present that next week. But I believe it was Adam who sinned first because he did not take the charge that God gave him seriously enough. It was when God came onto the scene, who was it he addressed first?
He addressed Adam.
He addressed Adam. It was Eve who took the bite. Of course, Adam did too, because he ate and she gave him and he ate. But she took the first bite, but God addressed Adam. And I think the reason that God addressed him first is because he had already messed up by not taking responsibility. And the punishment that was given on both of them, I think, reflects back on that. But so, if it came up on a test that who sinned first, the simple answer is Adam. The explained answer is he did not properly take or assume his responsibility that God had given him for his wife. If we are men, real men, godly men, we will fight tooth and nail to keep our wives pure and safe. Adam did not do that. He allowed her to be in that conversation. He was standing, it seems like he was right there because as soon as she took the bite, she turned to him. It seems the implication is she turned to him and says, here, you take a bite. So he was right there listening to the whole thing all the way through, and he did not speak up. Shame on Adam for that. Well, who is the old serpent?
That would be Satan.
That's Satan. How is the serpent different than any other beast of the field?
He was settled. Not settled, but
subtle is the right word, or cunning.
Cunning, yes.
The word is cunning in the New King James. I think the King James uses the word subtle. Now, the serpent was more subtle or more cunning than any beast of the field. And I forget who I quoted. I think it was either Kaufman or Matthew Henry that said, and I think he probably took it a little more than I would have, but he said that he wasn't a beast at all, because the wording of the, as he saw it anyway, it's not any other beast of the field, but any beast of the field. If he were a beast like the others, this commentator said, then the text would say, now the serpent was more subtle than any other beast of the field. But he simply said any beast of the field. That would make the serpent and Satan more synonymous, I guess, than they actually are. I see the serpent as possessed by Satan, much like the angel possessed the donkey that spoke to Balaam. He was still a donkey, but he spoke because he was possessed by the angel. And then in this case, the serpent spoke like the guy in Mark chapter 5 who was possessed of 2,000 demons. They spoke through him. Whose voice was it? Well, you heard the man's voice, but it was the demons that was speaking through him. And I think that's what's happening here. Satan has possessed this serpent in whatever form he was. He had, it seems, legs, which were taken away from him, and he was made to crawl on his belly. He was, and that's the answer I'm looking for. It was, the serpent is Satan, or at least a snake, a serpent possessed by Satan, and he was different than the other animals in that he was subtle. He possessed cunningness above what animals normally have. Animals are cunning. I mean, you can't have a cat in the house without knowing that. I don't like cats because they are so cunning. I won't have a cat in my house. Actually, I did because my daughter wanted a cat, so I capitulated and gave my daughter a cat, and I regretted it for years afterwards. Because then my son wanted a cat, so then I had 2 cats in the house. I hate cats. I don't want a cat in my house, but I had 2 in the house. That shows you how weak I am when it comes to my kids. But anyway, cats. How do we get to cats? Subtle serpents. He was more subtle than, or more cunning than a fox. There's certain cunningness that an animal must have in order to survive. The alligator, you don't know he's there until it's too late to know he's there because he's cunning. He sneaks up on you. The lion, he's cunning. He sneaks up on his prey without the prey knowing it, or at least he tries to. He's cunning. But the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field, and it's because he was possessed of Satan.
Mike.
Yes, sir.
Can we back just a little bit? I want to ask you one question about Eve and the encounter she had with Satan, the snake. When they were communicating, he had got her alone. So if they were alone, where was Adam at the time? You said that he was right there with her when they ate of the fruit. But where was he when they had the communication between the two, the conversation?
What makes you think they were alone?
Because from what I've read now, and I may be reading it wrong, it was stated that the Satan waited until he got Eve alone.
Well, let's read it. It says, now the serpent was more, it's chapter 3, verse 1, was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, as God indeed said, you shall not eat of the tree of any tree of the garden. And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of every tree of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, God said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die, for God knows that in the day that you eat thereof, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw the tree was good for food and pleasant to the eyes, and the tree was desirable to make one wise, took its fruit, ate. She also gave to her husband, and he ate. Okay. There's no indication that Adam was not there. In fact, I think the indication is Adam was there. He was silent, sinfully silent.
Okay.
Yeah. In verse 2, it says we. She said we.
That's exactly right.
That gives an implication that both of them were there.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. That we there is a telling mark that, you know, she was speaking in the plurality, and you would assume if Satan had her alone, she would have said I.
Mm-hmm.
I was told.
Okay.
But my assumption is because she used the plural pronoun we, that's not, you can't be too dogmatic on that, because you can use a we, the editorial we, I suppose, in conversation. We have been told that God so loved the world. Well, I wasn't told that except through the scriptures. Jesus told that to Nicodemus.
Mm-hmm.
But through the scriptures I've learned, so I can say we. So she could have, in the editorial sense, said we, and Adam didn't have to be there necessarily. But I think, given the context, given the fact that she immediately turned to Adam and gave him to eat, I think he was there, and I think he was cowardly, sinfully silent.
Okay, thank
you. And I think that's the first sin.
Mm-hmm.
And if I ask it on a test, you got to say what I think. Ha ha ha. You can believe what you want. But when it comes to a test, that's the way it is.
Yes, sir.
That's one of the teacher's privileges, I guess.
Now I got my wheels thinking back to this. Now, James, and in the James account, if we allow our brothers to sin, which if Adam was there and he know this was going to be a sin and he allowed her to partake of that, which would be a sin, then he would just be at fault of a sin also. Correct?
I think so. I think because he had responsibility over her, and he did not take charge of that situation like God had given him the responsibility to do, I think that was his sin.
Yeah. Okay.
And if we have, whether you're talking about Christian brother to Christian brother or elder to the flock, I think elders do have responsibility if they know that their flock are engaged in sin and they say nothing or do nothing. Now, you can't hog tie somebody and say, you're not going to do this. The same with my children. When they're of adult age, I will go to them and I'll tell them that this ain't right. You can't do that and be right with God. But I can't force them to do anything. I don't know how much, if Adam, how far Adam was able to go in this scenario. If she just absolutely rebelled against his authority and went to Satan and said, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do this. I don't know how much, was Adam responsible for tying her up and keeping her away from the tree?
Gotcha.
I don't think that would be the case. I think each of us have our own personal responsibility, but she was to be in subjection to her husband. That came not at the fall, that was at creation. And that's Paul's argument in 1 Timothy chapter 2, that she was in subjection before the fall. One of her curses, the curse that was placed upon her is, because you did this, you're going to have to fight that the rest of your life. You're going to have to be in subjection to him, but you're not going to want to be. You started this. It's not so much a punishment that God said, okay, if that's the way it is, this is what I'm going to do. Because of the spirit she demonstrated there, he says, that's going to be a consequence in your life. And it has bled down through the generations, even to today. I think women are always want to well, let me put it a better way than that. Women always have to fight the desire to usurp over the man. And one of the battles that the church is losing today is they are giving the women the right to usurp that authority. One argument that was made about we have women elders, it's not because they've usurped authority, we gave them that authority. Well, you didn't have the right to give that. God gave that authority to you, and you don't have the right to give it up. It's just a sad thing what's happening in the church today as far as women. And please don't, I think I tried to make this point clear when we were talking about this, don't think I'm a woman hater. Don't think I'm a male chauvinist pig. I have an authority given to me by God, a responsibility given to me by God. And if I don't fulfill that responsibility, just like Adam, then I'll be held accountable for that. So I'm going to do it. The woman has a place as well, and it's not a demeaning place. Men can make it that way. Men can abuse their authority and try to make the woman less than he is. That's not the situation that God created. They were equal, but one had authority in this place, and she had authority in the Spirit through the different scriptures will point out what is her place, what can she do, what has she to do in God's kingdom, and she has much to do in God's kingdom. But leadership in the church, leadership in the home is not hers. It's the man's. We've messed that up. We started messing it up with Adam and Eve, and we've been messing it up ever since. And I think that's the curse that was placed upon them. It wasn't so much a God pronouncing a curse in that sense. It was more of a pronouncement of the consequence. You know, that you started this, and here's what's going to happen because of it. You started the ball rolling, it's going to keep rolling. And I think that's the idea. Good questions, good comments, guys. My next question I had here was, what happened, give me a synopsis, I guess, between Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 6?
Well, in Genesis chapter 3, that's when we do see the fall of man.
Right.
When we talk about sin, and then we go to into chapter 4, we see another fall again, which is Cain and Abel, the murdering of his brother, which this instance, God plays another picture here. He asks a question, not knowing, people not knowing the reason why he asks questions, because he knows all things. And he asks the question, but the main answer to this is, are we our brother keeper in the middle of this question asked? Because we as brothers, which is in Christ nowadays, we're supposed to be looking out for each other. But here you have a brother that takes someone else's life and is pleading from the earth. And God knows this. Then it's a curse that's laid on Cain. And this curse, once again, just like Eve and Adam had a curse laid on them from the tilling of the ground, then Cain, of course, has a curse, that will follow him also by men. Then we get into the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Adam, where the other son plays a picture here, which is Seth,
right,
which would be the lineage. If we go back, it would be the lineage, which was in actually was a part of your sermon about Enoch going back to Adam and going back to Seth, which will go to Enoch, which would be a lineage back to Christ.
Right.
So we will see the breakdown of the genealogy of that in chapter 5. And once we get in the end of chapter 5 and we go to Enoch, and it comes out of Enoch, and you know, of course, Enoch was taken. Of course, in your sermon, once again, you know, Enoch walked with God, and he was, God was pleased with him. And then we get to the end of that, and then it's into the, we get to Noah in chapter 6. And then that's where we get into what we would call a pattern, which should be all the structure of even the church and how we worship. Every single thing that God has created has a pattern that he wants. And so we get into that with Noah and those that will be saved.
I think that's a great sermon illustration, Lawrence, about building according to the pattern. We use that from Moses and the tabernacle and Noah and the ark. And you know, if we say that if Noah hadn't built out of gopher wood, that boat wouldn't have floated, because God said make it gopher wood. So if he had chosen pine or whatever, that boat would have sunk. If he had made it wider than God said, or longer than God said, or whatever than God said, that boat would. I think that's a good point to make, a good illustration to make. But the Bible actually doesn't use that illustration. And I would, in a minute, in a heartbeat, I would use that illustration. I think it's a valid point, but Moses doesn't make that illustration. Paul doesn't refer back that to an illustration, except in saying that he was obedient. Whoever wrote the book of Hebrews referring to Noah and his obedience, and we're told what he was, the commands that he was given to do, and he obeyed those commands. So in that sense, it is validated by the Bible. And I only said that to help you in your sermon preparations. When you start making illustrations out of the Bible, make sure they're valid illustrations. Make sure the Bible intended to illustrate that. And if you can draw a lesson from it, and I think this is a way to do it. I think the prophets did it this way. I think Jesus did it this way. If you can draw a lesson from something, then do so. But don't put words in God's mouth when you do it. Don't say God said that we have to build according to the pattern because of what Noah did. Does that make sense? Am I making sense here?
Yes.
It is a valid point, and I think you can use it as an illustration just because there is no book, chapter, and verse that actually states it in those words. Be careful that you don't do that.
Now, isn't fashion a illustration of the word fashion in Genesis?
Help me out. I don't understand.
When Noah was told according to the fashion, the way that is built, isn't fashion an illustration of a pattern?
I believe he did have a pattern. That's not my point.
Okay.
He did have a pattern. I mean, he was given the dimensions. We'll talk about that in a minute. They given the dimensions, and he had to follow that pattern. I believe that exactly. I believe 100% if he had built it out of any other thing, it wouldn't have floated. But God didn't actually say that. Does that make sense? He said, make it out of gopher wood. He didn't say, don't make it out of pine. And for that reason, I think there's a legitimate pattern as you use the word, and I would use the same word, and I would not hesitate in the sermon to say that he followed a pattern in building that boat, and we need to pattern our lives like that. In other words, whatever God says do, you do. Whatever God says don't do, you don't do. I think we can make that illustration. I try to be very careful that I don't put words in God's mouth that he didn't actually say, because there are some people who are just waiting for you to say, well, God said build according to the pattern like Noah did. Well, God didn't say that. That's a good illustration that we can take away from the passage, but God didn't actually say you have to build according to the pattern like Noah did.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying don't use the illustration. I'm just saying don't put words in God's mouth. I think it's maybe I'm picking at straws here or something, but for my own way of teaching, I try to be very careful that if I'm going to quote God, I quote him. And if I'm going to make a illustration from something I think God showed us, I'm going to say, this is what I understand that we can take away from this. Noah was told, build with gopher wood, make it this long, make it this wide. And I believe with all my heart that if Noah hadn't done that, that boat would not have floated.
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing actually in the scriptures that says that. It's just, it makes good sense, but there's nothing actually that says that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. The only thing I look at is in Genesis 6:15, and he said, this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of.
Right. You shall make a window, verse 16, you said?
15.
15. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be this long, this wide, and 50 cubits. Yeah. I understand what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying, that if he had
instruction, maybe I should use instructions because he had instructions.
You know, maybe I'm just making too much out of nothing, and I don't mean to do that. When Adam was told about the tree, he said, in the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. So he was given a command, don't eat it. And then he was given the consequence. When you do, you will surely die. That same understanding can be got from the Noahic story. He was told how to fashion, how to build the boat. He was not told, if you don't do it this way, the boat won't float. Mm-hmm. We make that assumption, and I think it's a good assumption. I think it's a true assumption. I'm just saying, don't put words in God's mouth that he didn't say. Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. That's just a personal peeve of my own.
No, I understand what you say. I understand.
When I preach about Noah, when I preach a sermon about Noah, I'm going to say that he was told to build that boat out of gopher wood. He was told to build that boat so wide and so tall. And I'm going to say that if he didn't do that, that boat would not have floated. But I can't actually quote a verse that says that. I think it makes common sense that that's what would have happened. The boat would not have floated. I believe that there were other boats that were around. People were in the shipping business by that time, most likely, and that there were boats that people had. They probably didn't have pleasure yachts that like we have today, but they had boats, fishing boats or whatever. And none of those boats floated. Why? Because they weren't made of gopher wood. They weren't made so many cubits high and so many cubits wide. And I think that's a good assumption to make, and I can all but state it as a matter of fact. I do know that there were no other survivors to the flood, and therefore, if there were other boats, and there had to be, it seems, those boats didn't float. I can't go to Genesis chapter whatever and verse whatever and say, God said, if you don't make it like this, your boat won't float. But I believe the implication is there. I just don't want to be so dogmatic about it to say that's what God said. And again, I may be just making too much ado about nothing. All right.
It was a good point.
So what I was looking for here, between Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, I guess I could start it with Genesis chapter 2, not verse 6, but between Genesis 3 and chapter 3 and chapter 6, we have a sin explosion. It starts out with taking a bite out of an apple. It wasn't an apple. We don't know what it was. What we do? It was the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, whatever that is. But they took a bite out of that fruit, and from that little bitty sin, it wasn't little bitty, it was an absolute rejection against God's authority. We have a sin explosion that took place, and by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6, we have left Genesis chapter 2, which was very good, and come to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, where it says, every thought and every imagination of every heart was evil continually. That's huge. I don't know how long it was. Was it 900 years? Was it 1,000 years? Was it 3,000 years? I don't know, but from whatever that time frame was between Genesis 2 and Genesis 6, we have darkness taking over the world completely. One man in all the world found grace in the eyes of God, or found favor in the eyes of God. And that's what I'm looking for in the question. What happened between Genesis chapter 3 and 6? Maybe I should make that chapters 2 and 6. And the answer is we have a sin explosion. It just took over the world. It took over quick. Back in the 1950s, you began to hear about people coming out of the closet. It was slow trickle. Not many people did it. Most people preferred to keep their homosexual tendencies or homosexual lifestyle secret. It just did not get out. They didn't want other people to know about it. But then came the 60s and 70s and 80s, 90s, and now the 2010s. What's the difference between in that just in that sphere between 1950 and 2019? And you just look at the sin explosion that took place in that sphere, in the homosexual agenda sphere, but between 1950, and don't know of a specific date, but I'm just putting one out there, 1950 and 2020, you've gone from people who 1 or 2 around the world, or 5 or 10 around the world might have come out of the closet during that time, to now you got people who just are in your face with it. You can't go to the donut shop without without finding a gay donut. It's just everywhere in your face, and you got men calling themselves women, women calling themselves men. You got homosexuals who are in political office running on the fact that they are homosexual. It has become so blatant, so deep, and so evil in just 50 years, 60 years. We have in between Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 6, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years. Think how evil it was. If we have progressed as far as we have in the last 60 years, just think what it will be like if something doesn't happen to stop it or to turn it around. What's going to happen to us in the next 60 years, let alone the next 1,000 years? Does that make sense? That's what I'm looking at Genesis chapter 3 to 6, or 2 to 6, that evil just grabbed a hold and ran with it, and it became darker and darker and darker and darker. I mean, the first sin was a man not taking charge of his wife. The second sin was the wife rebelled against God's word. The third sin was a man murdered his own flesh and blood brother. By the time you get into Genesis chapter 4, you got a man who's bragging about murdering a young man for some slight offense. He's made a song about it to his wives, more than one wife. Then you move on into chapter 6, and you got every imagination of every thought, evil continually. It's just awful, God awful, how it turned out. And that's why God brings that judgment like he did. That's why God was grieved in his heart. If you can't preach about that, you can't preach, man. What was Cain's sin? I'm glad both of you guys are online tonight because it's going to make it easier for me to go over this review, not having to do it through a recording and just talk to myself. So thank you for being here tonight. What was Cain's sin?
Cain had, if I'm not mistaken, I want to say Cain had two sins. One was when he did the offering, he was displeased about his offering because God said, well, why are you frowning? And he was like, he was displeased because of the offering. And then the other one was he killed his brother.
Okay. One was the result of the other, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
It started out that, well, if you look at the text there in Genesis chapter 4, it says that Abel brought of the firstborn of his flock and the fat thereof. Not only did he bring the firstborn, but he brought the best part of the firstborn and brought it to God, right?
Right.
Here's a guy whose heart's right with God. He wants to give his best to God. He has a humble attitude, a submissive attitude to God. He worships God. He recognizes God as sovereign, God as Lord. I want to give you the best that I have, even if it means I have to take food off my table. I want to give you the best that I have. And Cain, it says, what does it say? In the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Doesn't say he brought the first fruit. Doesn't say he brought the best of the first fruit. He just brought an offering to the Lord. There was some religiousness to him, but it seems that the author wants us to understand that he was not willing to give himself completely to God, or give him, to submit himself and respect God as he should have. He just brought an offering. Here, take it. And because there's no adjective describing his offering, like first fruits and best of the first fruit, he just brought an offering from the ground, a corn stalk, or maybe he brought an ear of corn. Maybe he brought a bushel of wheat, but there's nothing wrong with a bushel of wheat. There's nothing wrong with offering God corn. The issue was Cain, I think, like Ananias and Sapphira, one of the first sins in the church. Ananias and Sapphira, they gave to God, but they didn't give themselves to God. And I think that's Cain's problem. He wasn't willing to give himself. He wanted to be his own man. He wanted to be in charge of himself. And when God didn't accept that, the first thing he does is react to it by killing the one who did do what was right. So Cain's sin was, I think, a bad attitude toward God or toward worship.
Okay.
And yes,
okay.
he did murder, and yes, he did. His countenance fell, and God asked him, "Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, it'll be good." Implying that he didn't do well, but God gave him another opportunity. You can still do well. We don't see Adam or Cain running back out to the field. So, oh, I messed up. I'm sorry. We don't see him doing that. I think we see a stubbornness in him, a pride in him, that he wasn't willing to make amends. In fact, when God punished him, he said, what? Oh, I can't bear. It's too much for me to bear. God told him, you know, sin crouches at your door. I think it crouched at Abel's door. I think it crouched at Adam and Eve's door. It crouches at our door, and you have the ability. You should rule over it. You have the ability. You can do it. But Cain chose not to. He chose to give into it, just like his mother did, and just like apparently Adam did in not taking charge in his family like he should have. What did, I think one of you mentioned it a minute ago, what does innocent blood that has been shed do? What did Abel's blood do? His blood was innocent, spilled on the ground. What did God say it does?
It cried out.
It cries out. Innocent blood cries out to God. It cries out for justice. God hears that cry. I've got a series of lessons that I do about God heard their cry, and it's not original with me. I got it from somebody else, and to me, it's just the most powerful lesson that you go through the Bible and listen to the times or watch the times that God heard the cry of the innocent who were being treated unjustly. The word unjustly or unrighteously is a violent word in the Hebrew language. And that's what's happened here. It's a violence that has taken place, and the blood is crying out for the violence that has taken place. And it says, God, I can't take care of myself. I need you to take vengeance, and God's going to take care of that. When the Israelites in Egypt cried out, God heard their cry. What was their cry about? Well, they were being burdened more than they could bear. Their life was absolutely being treated with injustice or filled with injustice, and God heard their cry and he acted upon it. And I think this is one of the character traits or characteristics of God that we need to emulate in our life. When we see injustice, we don't need to just sit by and watch it. Oh, that's so sad. I can't believe that's happening. And that's what we do. We just don't do anything. We don't hear the cry. When we see injustice, we need to stop it, even if it's in little kids. Little kids have to learn, right? When you see a child treating another child badly, it's not cute. It may seem like it's cute for the moment, but wait 10 years, it's not going to be cute. If it's not stifled at the moment, it becomes not cute. It becomes a dark thing. And God knows that. He hears the cry of injustice from the blood of the innocent. And we need to take note of that in the church. We need to take note of that in our lives. God has strong feelings. I guess probably the strongest feelings that we see God demonstrate in the Bible is over injustice. He cares for the poor. He cares for the widow. He cares for the stranger in the land. He tells the Israelites, you care for the poor, you care for the widow, you care for the stranger in the land. You know why the people went into Babylonian captivity? Because they didn't do that. They were so fat and sassy. Oh, look, we're making so much money. King Uzziah? What king was it? I can't believe I can't think of his name. We'll call him Uzziah for right now because I don't have time to look it up. But he reigned for 50 years. Things were going great in the land. I mean, prospering. Everybody's making money. Well, not everybody was. Some people were making their living off the injustices made. They were stealing properties. Rich men were taking over poor men's properties. They were poor men were saying, well, I can't make a living, so I'll sell my property, or I will put my property in your hands until I can pay it back. And then eventually the rich man would actually possess the property, which they weren't allowed to do. And the poor man was left with nothing. He couldn't give his kids anything. He couldn't, I don't know what led him to his poverty, but you can't take advantage of the poverty. And when you do, God's going to act. I think this is one of the things about which God is most passionate. The two greatest commands are what? Love God, and secondly, love your fellow man. What does that mean? Don't treat him badly. Treat him as you would want to be treated. It goes back to injustice. Usury in the Old Testament was taking bribes against the innocent, the guilty, bribing, and the judges. Everything was corrupt. Injustice was prevalent throughout the land, and God says, or God did judge them because of it. It was basic teaching in their law, and they absolutely disregarded it. So how does God feel about injustice? If you put a emoji on it, it's a frowny face that's got that red tint to it. He's angry about injustice, and we need to be aware of that. The next question was, who was Enoch? I think it was Lawrence a few moments ago gave us a little bit of detail about him. Who was Enoch?
Enoch was a man that walked with God and was the great grandson of Noah.
The great grandfather.
Great grandfather of Noah. Okay.
He was the seventh from Adam through Seth. I think Lawrence said that a few moments ago. He was a good man who walked with God. I don't need a lot of explanation there, but he was a good man who walked with God in a dark time. Noah's time was dark, but Noah's time wasn't that far separated from. I think I had a slide that showed. Let me see if I can get that up. Got Noah here. Can y'all see my arrow? Enoch lived from 662 to 987, and Noah was born just a little bit after that, about 50 years, well, 70 years after that. So 70 years is not a long time when you're thinking thousands of years or 2,000 years. So Noah's time was probably a lot like Enoch's. And both of these men, Noah and Enoch, were able to walk with God in a dark, evil time. You know, you got sin starting here with Adam, and it just blew up and became what it was in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Who were the sons of God? According to what we talked about in class. I don't want to hear what a lot of people say. I just want to hear what we talked about in class.
Those was the faithful ones.
They're the faithful ones. I think that's right. It's a good answer. He traces it, I think, through the children of Seth, but I don't think it's necessarily, or we have to necessarily say they had to be of the bloodline of Seth. They were, whoever's bloodline they were from, they were the ones who were faithful to God. Cain and Seth are not the only two children of Adam and Eve. Abel, of course, but Abel's dead. But they had, what does it say? Did it number the kids or just say a bunch? Adam knew his wife again, Berseth. God said. Somewhere it talks about them having more children. Yeah, verse 4, chapter 5, verse 4. After he begat Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. So he had other children. And so the sons of God are those who came through, or who had the spirit of Seth, obedient spirit of Seth. And the daughters of men, the next question is, who were the daughters of men? Would be just the opposite, those who had the spirit of Cain. Not necessarily a bloodline connection, but those who demonstrated that spirit. And the sons of God intermarried with the daughters of men, and what was the outcome? Not good. It talks about the giants in the land. We talked about that. They may have been men who were of giant stature. I don't deny that, but I think as the text goes on to explain, it wasn't just their big size that was the issue. It was they were men of renown. They had built for them a big reputation, and it wasn't good. You can have a big reputation and be good, but these were men who had a big reputation. We talked about Jesse James and Bonnie and Clyde and people like that. We know their names from the evil they did. And that's what these men were. Whether they were big men or not, I'm willing to say, yes, they were big men, but they were men of renown because they had these huge, evil, violent reputations. And that was the product of the sons of God marrying in with the daughters of men. Why that became the case, I can't say for sure, but it's a sharp rebuke, or at least a very strong caution or warning: don't marry the daughters of men. Their influence over you is going to be strong. And if you're not strong enough to overcome it, it's not saying that you can. It can happen that a son of God can marry a person of the world, and he convert that person and train that person, disciple that person, they become a child of God. But the numbers are in that that's not what happens most of the time. Usually it's the other way around, and their kids become a holy terror, spiritually speaking. When the daughters of men, their influence overcomes the sons of God give it up completely, and they just lose all abandon, and no respect for God is had in that household. Be careful who you marry. When you talk to young people in the church, tell them, be careful who you marry. I don't think it's a sin. Somebody would say, some people would go so far as to say it's a sin to marry outside the Lord. I don't know that we could go that far. It is terribly, terribly unwise, but I don't know that we could go so far as to say it's a sin, because if it's a sin, how do you repent of it? You have to divorce that spouse, and that's another sin. So I won't go so far as to say it's a sinful thing to marry outside the Lord, but we are so strongly cautioned by illustration as well as by teaching, don't marry outside the Lord. When we were talking about that, I came to the conclusion that angels having sex with women and producing a new race is not a reasonable conclusion. Why did I come to that conclusion? What brought me to that conclusion? What reasoning or scripture did I use to say that I think that's a poor conclusion?
Because angels wasn't given into marriage, or it was scripture about angel wasn't given into marriage. We don't have no scripture that say that angels was married.
Well, we are told that angels are not like us. They don't have physical abilities like us, but they can. Angels have taken on the appearance of a man. There were angels that came to Abraham in the plains of Mamre in the Sodom and Gomorrah, or just before the Sodom and Gomorrah thing, and they looked like men, they ate like men. Abraham fed them. In fact, God was among that number that was there. So they can take on the appearance, the body of a man. So I don't think we could say that it's wrong based on that, or it's a wrong conclusion based on that, because that can happen. Whether or not they can have sex with the man or woman, that's another matter. But if they can take on the appearance of a man, I would assume they take that appearance on completely. My argument was, in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he says, God will not allow us to be tempted more than we can bear. For angels to take on the form of a man and so overpower women and have sex with them, that would be more, I think, than these are supernatural powers. It's not a man raping a woman. It's an angel with supernatural power. Raping or having sex with, I don't know. The Bible doesn't go into that. But the sons of God, if they were angels coming upon women like that, that's a supernatural power, and the woman does not have the ability to overcome that. They didn't have people at the time that we know of anyway that were casting out demons. That's something that God did through Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament. When demons possessed men, the power was there for those demons to be exorcised or to be thrown out. if this is demon possession, demon angels who have fallen from their position and taken on a form of a man and having sex with women, I think that's more than would have been able to bear in that situation. And I think that passage tells me, along with, I think, just common sense, that that's not the conclusion that we can come to. It's not a conclusion I can come to. What is it, 1 Corinthians 10:13? Is that the passage I was looking at? Yes, 1 Corinthians 10:13. That's the passage we went to indicate that angels having authority over men like that would be more temptation, more trial than the woman or person could bear. All right. Well, the review went a lot longer than I intended for it to, but that's okay. We got some stuff discussed that we hadn't that we needed to discuss. Let's take a break, and we'll come back and we'll jump back into where we left off last week with Noah. All right?
Okay.
Let's take about 5 or 10 minutes, I guess. Well, we'll make it 10 minutes. Give you guys a break. Good discussion, guys. I really appreciate it. I'm going to pause the recording if I can figure out how. Okay, guys, you back?
Yes, sir.
All righty. We left off last week talking about Noah, how Moses left, introduced us to Noah in the beginning of chapter 6. He showed us the sin explosion that took place, and he introduced us to Noah and the grace of God. The grace of God's been apparent all along, that mankind made it past the first sin is an act of the grace of God. But we begin to see more and more of the grace of God as we move on. And he describes Noah, and we may have talked about this last week, I don't know for sure, as just and perfect. That word just, sometimes it's translated as righteous. He's just or righteous. And as it's used throughout the Old Testament, it speaks of I put it here in my notes because I thought it was a good description, an unimpeachable integrity. They're trying to impeach President Trump. They probably have lots of good things to throw at him because of the lack of integrity with which he has lived in his life, and whether or not he's doing things politically without integrity, not mine to judge. I don't get involved in it. But here's a man who, no matter how much mud they sling at him, they can't find anything that'll stick because he is just. He is righteous. He is, it's the same word that Moses would use to describe the animals that were to be brought to the, or to be used as sacrifice. They are to be without blemish. It's the same word. The word without blemish and just or righteous is the same word. Noah is without blemish. That's not to say he's a perfect man. We'll see some imperfection in him in later chapter, but he was he was a just man, not without mistake. But here's, the local community, the people with whom he lived, they could not throw mud at him and it stick because he was a just man. He was also called perfect. And that word perfect is a Hebrew term that the Hebrews did then, do now, generally used to describe a good man, just a good person. He's a just, without blemish, good person. Elders are supposed to be without blame. That's the same idea, that they're to be have that character about them. It's not to say they're perfect. None of us are. But he's a man who lives his life with integrity, trying to be the person that God wants him to be. That's his conduct. He's given the description that he walked with God like Enoch did. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, it says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intent of the thoughts of of man's heart was evil continually. Just the opposite of what Noah was. Noah, he didn't think evil. Not to say he didn't do bad things. On occasion, he slipped and fell like the rest of us do, but he didn't think evil. It wasn't ingrained in his heart. And that word wickedness of man, when it says the Lord saw the wickedness of man, it's a very violent term. Verse 13 actually says the earth was full of violence. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy the earth. Because men could only think evil, what's going to happen if God just lets it go? Well, between Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 6, you see what happens. It just becomes worse and worse. Man won't correct his actions by himself. He needs God's help. God intended man to fill the earth with image bearers of God. What they have done is filled the earth with corruption. They filled the earth with violence. There it says in verse 11, the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. God said, be fruitful and multiply. But he wanted them to multiply the goodness, the integrity, the justness and goodness of God, or that God gave them. They had the ability to do that. They weren't sinful by nature, they were sinful by choice. And that's the case with any of us. But we've created a world, they did, and we have as well, filled with violence. And that word violence, the Hebrew word Hamas, means to be cold-blooded, unscrupulous, infringing upon the rights of others. A person who's motivated by greed will do anything that he can to get whatever it is he wants, whether it's power or money or whatever it is. He will cold-heartedly, unscrupulously get that, and it's just the opposite of love your fellow man. So we're dealing here with the darkest shades of human sinfulness, dark because violence or injustice has always been a personal insult to God, and we're supposed to be bearing his image. Violation of the two greatest commands: love God and love your fellow man. And I think, I pointed this a lot in my lessons and my teaching in the class. I'm going to talk about the two greatest commands. I'm going to talk about it a lot because they are the two greatest commands. These are the basic teachings. If you could boil down the Bible to two teachings, it would be: one, love God; two, love your fellow man. And when you treat men with injustice, you violate both. You violate your love of God because you're treating one who bears the image of God in this way, and you violate the love of man because of what you're doing to him. God told Noah to build a boat, build an ark, fashion an ark, as one of you said a while ago. What does this boat look like? Got any ideas? If you were to imagine it in your mind, or maybe you've seen pictures of what it might have looked like. What does it look like? Does it look like this? I'm thinking not. It's a barge, a big old ugly barge. It wasn't intended to be a cruise ship with all the amenities and all the luxuries of life. It was a box. It was meant to float. One of the things that you won't find on the ark is a rudder, able to give guidance to the ship, or you don't find sails on the ship. It's just a box that floats on the water. That's its only purpose. That's all it's intended to do is float, keep the people and the animals above the water. It was constructed out of gopher wood. Some people say it was cypress. Some people say it was oak. We don't know what it was. We've lost any connection as to what kind of wood actual gopher wood is. We can name a tree gopher wood today, but it wouldn't necessarily mean that that's what it was. The unit of measurement that was used by the Hebrews, was the cubit. How big is a cubit? Anybody know?
I think it's 1 foot and 6 inches.
1 foot and 6 inches. If you measure the distance between the tip of your finger and your elbow, it's going to be, generally speaking, some people are taller than others, some people are shorter. Generally, it's going to be about 18 inches. So it'd be about right what you said, 1 foot and 6 inches. So about 18 inches. It's a term used over 100 times in Scripture, and generally speaking, that's how the Hebrews would have rendered it, and depends on the size of the man that's building the house as to how big it will actually be, but will only vary within a few centimeters or a few inches, because the cubit was, everybody's got an arm, everybody's got a forearm, and they all measure about the same feet. If you take those measurements, 18 inches, the ark would have been 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high, with a total deck space of about 95,700 square feet. That's a big house. By comparison, you see the ark there? This structure here, this square box or rectangular box, that's basically what the ark looked like. That's the dimensions, 45 feet high, 450 feet long, 75 feet wide. You see this airplane here, compared to the ark, it's a pretty, the ark's pretty big thing. But you compare it to the Titanic, or one of these big ships up here, one of these aircraft carriers, it's not a big boat. Here's a boat up here that was the, I forget what the name of the,
Enterprise.
Enterprise, thank you. It's covered up on my screen. I can't see it. The Enterprise and the Titanic, by comparison, it's pretty small. It's not small, it's big, but by comparison to these ships, it's pretty small. But it wasn't intended to be an aircraft carrier. It wasn't intended to be a cruise ship. It was intended to be a box to keep animals and people alive. If you look at the football field here, and this is the illustration I found. I don't like Alabama, but that's the only illustration I found that had it on there.
Man, bad business.
It's got Alabama on it. I wish I could put Tennessee on there, but I couldn't manipulate it like that. Standard size house over here. You compare that to the ark, and you can get a bunch of houses in there. So it's a football field is 360 feet long, including the end zones, about 160 feet wide. And in comparison, the ark was 450 feet long and 75 feet wide. So about the same. The measurements are, one's wider and one's longer, but it's pretty close to the same. The ark's much longer, but not nearly as wide. There's a gap or an opening of a cubit's width at the top of the ark that would serve as its window, probably for ventilation. If you ever get the chance to go to Cincinnati, not Cincinnati, but just south of Cincinnati, to the, what's it called? The Ark Experience, or the Ark something, I forget what it's called. It's worth the money, it's worth the time, it's worth the trip. Take your kids, spend lots of money because that's what they want you to do, but you'll get a great education. You'll get a feel for the size of the ark because they tried to build it according to those dimensions. So it has a door. The window, I think, is probably not just, it's probably something similar to what it has here, this opening that's across around the top. It was there for ventilation purposes. So it's an opening of a cubit's width at the top of the ark, a cubit from the top of the ark. And again, the thing that's missing, it has no rudder, it has no sails. It was not intended to be a cruise ship. And I think there's a subtle, maybe not so subtle implication there. The fate of everyone on board was not up to the wind. It wasn't up to the currents. It was up to God. Everything was in God's hands. God says, well, put this boat out here or this box out here in the water. I'll take care of it. It wasn't going anywhere. It didn't need to go anywhere. There was no place to go. There was no land for it to go to. So it just floated with the storm-tossed seas. And because of its dimensions, it wasn't something that was easily going to be tipped over. But they were in God's hand. It's just a container, a cracker box, you might say, to shelter all the animals and people that were in its big boat. And it's, when we compare it to some of the boats of our day and time, okay, it's not as big as that, but it didn't need to be as big as that. I'm told, I won't know this by my own self, just what I've been told, it had the carrying capacity of 15,000 tons. That's a lot of beef. And it needed to carry a lot of beef, not necessarily beef, but a lot of animals. By comparison, the largest ships of Noah's day, or even in the last, in Jesus' day, in that time, the largest ships of antiquity could carry about 4,000 tons. This boat had the capacity of 15,000 tons. For most of the Old Testament period, not just in the Old Testament, the Hebrews weren't great, weren't renowned sailors, but they did have some. But for the most part, ships were no longer than 170 feet in length. And here's one that's 450 feet long. So it's compared to the time, it was a big boat, unprecedented in the ancient world. Noah was instructed to place in the ark what?
Animals.
Animals. How many animals?
Two of each kind.
Look at chapter 7, verse 2. What does it say?
Take thee by seven.
7 of clean animals. Unclean animals, 2 by 2, just like you said. But of clean animals, he said put in 7. So that takes up the number of animals quite considerably. And they were to take enough food for the voyage. I used to say that he took the clean animals so they'd have something to eat. But that'd be a lot of food. If you took 7 of every clean animal, whatever that, whatever fits in that definition for a little over a year, you can't eat that much. 8 people can't eat that much. There's a reason why, and I can't say what it is because I don't know, but I'm sure there's a reason why God said take 7 of the clean animals and 2 of the unclean animal. And to your point a while ago, Lawrence, he said that so Noah did everything exactly as God commanded him. There in verse 22, thus Noah did according to the will of God, to all that God commanded him, so did he. In chapter 7 and verse 5, it says, and Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Again in verse 9, they too went in the ship, as God had commanded Noah. Verse 16 says, so those entered, male and female, all flesh went as God commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. So there is plenty of evidence that Noah obeyed God. It's stated over and over again. Noah did as God commanded. And whatever we make of that, I think we can make great sermon illustrations out of that. So I don't want to go back into that again. But Noah did the will of God. Let's, let's just go ahead and read the chapter 7 and 8. We won't spend a lot of time in chapter 7 and 8, but I do want to be fair to the text and read it. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." That's, I think, key. In this generation, you are righteous before me. You beat everybody else hands down. You're not perfect in the sense of without absolute perfection, but you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you 7 of each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 animals that are unclean, a male and his female, and also 7 each of birds of the air, male, female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. So there's your reasoning to keep the species alive on the face of the earth. The clean animals being having a priority, it seems, over the unclean. For after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days, 40 nights. I will destroy from the earth, or from the face of the earth, all living things that I have made. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So Noah, with his sons, his wife, his sons' wives, went into the ark because of the waters of the flood, of clean animals, of animals that were clean and unclean, of animals that were unclean, of birds, and of everything that creeps on the earth. 2 by 2, they went into the ark, male and female, as God commanded them. Noah. It makes me think, guys, when I says 7 of the unclean, you shall take with you 7 of each of every clean animal, a male and his female. That makes it 14. They went in 2 by 2, but with the clean animals, there was going to be 14 of them, because it wouldn't be 2 by 2, a male and his female, if there were only 7. Somebody gets left out. So what it is 7 males and 7 females. It's not important, I don't guess, or it is important because it's here, but that's
now wouldn't that particularly be about sacrifice? Because later the clean animals that would be a part of sacrifice, correct?
Yeah, they were to offer clean animals as sacrifice. I don't know the law that was given to the patriarchs. I do know the law that was given to the Jews, and it's specifically stated there. The implication is that they were to offer clean animals back then as well in the patriarchal age. There's just no stated law for that. Does that make sense?
Understand.
But I would agree with you that the assumption is that because they're going to offer a lot of clean animals as sacrifice to God. I don't know how much sacrificing was done on the actual ark. I don't know if it's a good thing to build a fire inside the ark, but I don't know how much of that was done. The text doesn't say. Where did I get to? It came to pass after 7 days, the waters of the flood were on the earth in the 600th year of Noah's life, and 6th month, 2nd month, 17th day of the month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rains were on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. I think I have this on the text for you guys to read. No, I don't. On the same day, Noah and his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and 3 wives and his sons were with him, entered the ark. That they and every beast of after its kind, all the cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. Moses gets pretty specific here. They went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2, all flesh that was in the breath, in which was the breath of life, so that those entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Now the flood waters were on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth. The ark moved about the surface of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps upon earth, and every man, and all in whose nostrils the breath of the spirit of life, all that was on dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the earth, both man and cattle, creeping things, birds of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were there with him in the ark, and God made a wind pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained, and the waters receded continually from the earth, and the end of the 150 days was at the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, the mountains of the Ararat, and the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. And the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the windows of the ark in which he had made. Then he sent out a raven, which was going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. He also sent out from himself a dove to see if the waters had receded from the face of the ground. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her feet, and she returned into the ark to him, for the waters were on the face of the earth, the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and drew her into the ark to himself. And he waited for another 7 days, and again he sent the dove out from the ark. The dove came to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth, and Noah knew that the waters had receded from the earth. So he waited yet another 7 days and sent out the dove, which did not return again to him anymore. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the 1st month, 1st day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. In the 2nd month, on the 7th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife, your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went, and his sons and wives and sons' wives with him, every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, whatever creeps on the earth according to their families. The word families there should be species, most likely their kinds. According to their kinds, went out of the ark. Then then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal, of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar and the Lord. Notice that word Lord again. What do we say about that?
Yahweh.
Yahweh. It's the Hebrew word Yahweh, or we would pronounce it Jehovah in the English language. The King James, New King James, puts the word Lord there, I guess, in deference to the Jewish mind, who does not want to pronounce the name of God because they don't want to take God's name in vain. That's not exactly what God meant, but it's a respectable thought anyway. And the Lord smelled the smoothing aroma. The Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living creature as I have done while the earth remains. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and the day shall not cease. The day and night shall not cease." So there's a lot of date stamps here, a lot of detailed information. I think Moses is trying to, through inspiration, emphasize this is not a tale. This is a history of the flood. It's not a once upon a time scenario. There, he names the time. He speaks of a specific day, a specific month when this or that happened. So Moses is trying to give credibility by showing the dates that these things were done. It wasn't once upon a time. At the time of Moses was writing, 1,000 years or so past the flood. There were lots of flood stories circulating. There were some 300 ethnicities that were scattered all over the world. And all of these different ethnicities had stories that were being handed down. Shem told his kids, Shem's kids told their kids, Shem's kids' kids told their kids, and so forth. Same thing with Japheth, the same thing with Ham. They all told their kids, and the stories went out all over the world, and they got added to, just like Eve added to God's word in Genesis chapter 3. So they all added to, and you had all kinds of stories that began popping up. Some of them have survived even to today. You can Google the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you can find there a story of the flood. It's going to have some similarities to the Noahic flood, but there's going to be a lot of differences too. One, the critics say that Moses or the Hebrews copied from Gilgamesh or from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we would say that the Epic of Gilgamesh copied from the scriptures. But the point is, there are lots of stories which indicate something did happen. And Moses says, yes, something did happen. Let me give you the facts. Here's the facts on it. This is the God-breathed version. God was the only one alive at the time that Moses was writing, who was there at the time of the flood. So here God says, here's what happened. Put it down on paper, give dates to it, show them what happened. This is not a once upon a time event or a story. A plain reading of the text makes it seem that the narrator wants to slap us in the face, so to speak, with data to help us understand this was a real event. It says in verse 5, for the Lord God had not caused, chapter 2, verse 5, I'm sorry. I may have it on the text here. Yeah. That the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, had not caused it to rain on the earth, as of chapter 2, verse 5. And there was no man to till the ground, but a mist. Here's how God watered the earth. A mist came up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. You might think of it as humidity or a thick dew. That's how the ground was watered. They didn't need rain. And there's a reason, I think, for that. They had a canopy over the earth that separated the firmament that we talked about in chapter 1. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, it says, by faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household. Moses, I think, takes great pains to emphasize that this disaster, this judgment, was an act of God. Both the condemnation of the world and the survival of Noah's family were both intentional acts of divine providence. You can call it justice or you can call it salvation. Depends on which way you look at it or which one you're talking about. But if you look at it, God had warned Noah of the flood. God had commissioned the ark to be built for the salvation of Noah's family. He led the family into the ark. He brought the animals to Noah. He sent rain upon the earth, and he caused the floodwaters to come up, and he caused the floodwaters to recede. So overwhelming was this deluge that even the tallest mountains were covered with more than 20 feet of water. You think about that. The tallest mountains covered with 20 feet of water. Now, I don't believe that the tallest mountains of that time were like the tall mountains of our time. I think the tall mountains of our time came about as a result of what God did to cause the floodwaters to recede. He caused the waters to stop, the heavens stopped, and the fountains of the deep stopped. But then God raised up the mountains, and you can see, if you go out west and look at the bare mountains, you can see where the earth's crust was just broken and pushed up. And I think God did that. And when he did that, he pushed those mountains up. It caused all that water to go away, and it went rushing away. Don't want to go back into that. That's what we talked about in that film. But that water's rushing away as God broke up the earth's crust and caused the waters to go away is what caused all the canyons and events in the Earth's crust, it looks like great amounts of water chewed through it. Evolutionists say it took millions of years for that to happen. I think it took days, maybe minutes, for that to happen. You might think of the flood as a reversal of the creation story of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Might call it a divine renovation, global renovation. In Genesis chapter 1, God saw everything that he made was good. Behold, it was very good. Then in Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, it says, God saw the earth, behold, it was corrupt. So he set into action a global renovation project. Lord brought the animals to Noah, just as he had brought the animals to Adam in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 1 spoke of that expanse or that firmament dividing the waters from the waters. You got waters here and you got waters here, and in the midst you have this firmament that keeps the waters above. That was removed, and the fountains of the deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven came down. 4 times in Genesis chapter 7, it uses the word prevailed. Moses wanted to paint a complete picture here. This word prevailed is used throughout the Old Testament as a military term, what an army would do to another army, or one nation might do to another nation. The floodwaters were God's army dispensing justice and punishment on this corrupted planet. All life was extinguished, and everything that God had given breath of life to was now taken away outside of those who were in the ark. So we see in this the wrath of God, but we also see in this the mercy of God. And I think I referred you to a passage in Habakkuk where Habakkuk prayed to God, in your wrath, remember mercy. And he did that here. The first act of creation was, as you recall, back in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, that the Spirit of God was moving upon the face of the water. The first act of the recreation or the restoration of the earth after the flood was that God's Spirit moving on the face of the water. Look at chapter 8, verse 1, where it says, then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark, and God made a what? A wind to pass over the earth, and the waters were subsided. That word wind is the same word as spirit. God made a wind, God made a spirit to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. Maybe it was a wind, but I think it's significant that Moses chose here the word that was used. But it says there, before the Spirit moved, or before the wind blew, God remembered Noah. What does it mean, remembered? Oh man, I forgot. It's time to get Noah out of the ark. I forgot all about that. God was so busy dealing with other things that he forgot about Noah, and he just remembered. Is that what it was? Shake your heads like this. No, that's not what it was. Not what it was. God doesn't forget. You and I forget where we left our keys. You and I forget where we left the car in the mall parking lot. For God to remember, as this word here is used, indicates that he's about to take action on someone's benefit or for someone's welfare. He's going to deliver in a mighty way. In Genesis chapter 19, verse 29, I thought I had it up there. There it is. And it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain, talking about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, that God what? Remembered Abraham. Well, what did he do when he remembered Abraham? He sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt. So God remembered Abraham, and he said, okay, I'm going to save Lot, your nephew, from this overthrow that I'm about to do in Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis chapter 30, it says, then God remembered Rachel, and Rachel listened to her and opened her, and God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. What does it mean he remembered? He's going to do a favor for her. He's going to act on her behalf. She hadn't had children. Her handmaid had children. Her sister had children. Her sister's handmaid had children. She had no children, and she was suffering emotionally because of that. And so God remembered her and gave her a child. We know he was Joseph. In Exodus 2, verse 24, it says, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's remembering, not that he had forgot, but he is going to now act in behalf of the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In Exodus 32, now therefore let me alone, Moses speaking, or God speaking to Moses, now therefore let me alone. The Israelites had been stubborn and rebellious and murmuring again. And so God says, I'm going to, my wrath is going to burn hot against them. I'm going to consume them, and I will make of you a great nation, Moses. And Moses pleaded with the Lord and said, Lord, Yahweh, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, he has brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn, Moses pleads, turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm that you to your people. Remember Abraham. There's that same word. Isaac and Jacob. Act on behalf of the covenant. Act benevolently upon behalf of the covenant that you made with them. One more. Psalm 74, verse 1. O God, why have you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation. It's not that God has forgotten. He's pleading with him to act in behalf of his people. So God doesn't forget in that sense. God remembers in the sense that he does something in favorable consideration on behalf of the person about whom he is speaking. That's what's taking place with Noah. The ark came to rest on dry ground. Some people say they found it thousands of years later. I don't know that they have. I don't know that they will. I don't know that it matters. I think probably all that wood was probably milled, and it'd be quite wasteful for them to throw it away. There were no mature trees at the time, so they used that wood probably to build houses and things of that nature for their families. It would be my guess. I don't think the ark still exists. I may be proven wrong on that someday, and I'm perfectly willing to be wrong. Came to rest on dry ground. Been 6 months since the last raindrop, or since the first raindrop began to fall. Noah had waited 75 more days before the peaks of the surrounding mountains were visible. 4 days later, he sent out a raven, and what did the raven do? Chapter 8, verse 7.
Yeah. It came back once it was dried up.
Yeah, it says he went, the raven went out, and he was going to and fro until the waters dried up from the earth. What's he doing going to and fro? A raven is an unclean bird. He eats from the carrion, the floating debris on the waters, and he's probably going out and getting something to eat, coming back, going out and getting something to eat and coming back, going out and getting something to eat and coming back. He's eating off the corpses of animals and fish and men that were in the water. He was not readmitted into the ark like the dove was. He was left to stay out on the top of the ark. I don't know if there's any significance to that or not. He sent out a dove. What happened to it? Verse 9, chapter 8, verse 9. The dove found no resting place for the sole of her feet, so she returned into the ark. The dove came back in. The raven didn't. The dove is not able to survive off the floating debris, so she came back for refuge, and Noah took this as further evidence that the earth was not yet habitable. A week later, 7 days later, he sent out another dove, and what happened to it?
Came back with the olive leaf.
Came back with the olive leaf. The olive leaf or the olive branch has been used for centuries as a sign or token of peace. Some say that this means that God made peace with the earth, and no doubt Noah was encouraged by that. I don't know if we can make anything stick as far as that goes. It's another one of those illustrations that makes good sense that that's what it means, but it's never said that's what it means. Anyway, a week later, this is the third week, he sent out another dove. What happened to it? Verse 12.
Didn't come back.
Waited 7 days, sent out a dove, which did not return to him anymore, which means what? He made a nest somewhere. He's found dry land, and he can build a nest on dry land. He builds nests in trees or wherever doves build their nest. Adam Clark, in his commentary, said, from this, Noah conjectured that the earth was now sufficiently drained, and therefore removed the covering of the ark, which probably gave liberty to many of the fowls to fly off, which circumstance would afford him the greater facility of making arrangements for disembarking the beasts and reptiles and heavy-bodied domestic fowls, which might remain. Mariners have used birds for this purpose for centuries, trying to find land when they're lost at sea. You find most ships, at least in ancient times anyway, they carry a bird with them, and a series of several birds, pigeons, usually with them for that purpose. So if they got lost at sea, the bird could be let go, and he would return to him, most likely, but they would return with evidence that dry land is by. Noah wasn't given a command to leave the ark or to send out the birds. Maybe he did this by inspiration. Maybe he did this because he's anxious to get off the boat. He's been on the boat for a long time with a lot of stinky animals. It's a hard job, I would imagine, being on a boat, tending to all those animals and dealing with all that you have to deal with. I mean, you just have one dog in the house, and it's, he rules your life by taking him out to walk once or twice a day and everything, and feeding him once or twice a day. Well, here's Noah with all these animals tending to him. He's probably pretty tired of that. Came to pass in the 600th year, 601st year, in the first month, first day of the month, the waters dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, indeed, the surface of the ground was. So it's been about a year that Noah's family was in the ark, and then, verse 15, then God spoke to Noah. Was what Noah did beforehand, sending out the birds, was that Noah's own ingenuity? Was that something God was giving him direction to do? We don't know, except that here it says, then God spoke to Noah. So here's where God says, here's what I want you to do. He wasn't looking for Noah to go out before, now he does. And then verse 18, so Noah did go out. He did wait for God's word, but he seemed to kind of be in a hurry for it. Do we ever do that? Sometimes we get anxious for a word from God, and we're tempted to move on without him. I don't know that Noah was so tempted or not, but it seems the implication is that Noah was anxious to get out, but Noah was wise. He waited till God spoke, and then he went out. I think that speaks well of Noah. Verse 21 says, and Noah, or the Lord, smelled a soothing aroma, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for the sake of man, or for man's sake, although the imagination of his heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. So God is swearing by himself, or to himself, that he would never allow such a disaster to repeat itself. Paul uses this phrase, soothing aroma, in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2. He says, and walk in love as Christ also loved us and gave and has given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet smelling aroma. The sacrifice that Christ offered, we don't often think about it like this, but I think it's good to think about it. The sacrifice that Christ offered was in obedience to God. Jesus came down here to show us the Father, but he came down here also to show us how to be in a relationship with the Father. You do what the Father says. And Jesus, there in the Garden of Gethsemane, before he died, he says, Lord, if there's Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass, but your will be done. He wanted to do something different. He didn't want to go through this extreme agony and pain that he knew he was looking at, both spiritually and physically. But Christ submitted to the Father, and that submission, sacrificial submission, is a sweet smelling aroma to God. Guys, God is always pleased when we, against all reason, against all instruction or persecution, when we sacrifice and obey, God is always pleased. He used this phrase here with Noah. The phrase is used throughout the Old Testament when the children of Israel were obedient. It was used of Christ when he was obedient. One commentator said that the Spirit's use of this word in both places leads me to think that Noah's sacrifice somehow prefigured that of Christ. It was an obedient sacrifice. He says that the human heart was in the same evil state that it had been before the flood. What do you take from that?
They still had residual.
Yeah, that things haven't changed a whole lot. It's not to say that the flood was for nothing, but it does say that the human heart was in the same evil state that it had been before the ark. God had cleansed the earth, and in doing so, he made a statement to all humanity. At that time, all humanity outside the ark died. So the statement is being made to Noah and his family, and for them to tell their children. But the people outside the ark who died, they heard it too. In fact, I think that's a lot of what Peter said. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, or last week it was, when he said that the Spirit of Christ was preaching to those souls in prison. Did we talk about that? Did we talk about that passage in Peter?
We did.
Okay. I won't go back into it then. But God's making a statement here. Sin is not without consequence. Some people say this passage supports the thought of sinful nature or original sin. And I don't think it does. It doesn't say that man's heart was sinful from his conception, but from his youth, when a man is young and is influenceable, able to be influenced, his heart becomes corrupt. I don't think it teaches here that this is at conception because of a curse that God placed upon Adam. And again, we could show that if that's the case, if the curse of Adam is that all of his descendants will inherit his sinful nature, then Jesus could not state that the children about whom he spoke on more than one occasion were innocent, because they're not innocent. If we take all of Calvin's doctrine, including sinful nature, some of them are innocent because they were pre-chosen by Christ or God to be innocent, but some of them were damned, never to be redeemed, able to be redeemed, because God had damned them before the foundations of the earth. Jesus could not say that these children were innocent if this doctrine is true. Verse 22 says, while the earth remains, seed time, harvest, cold, heat, winter, summer, and the day and night shall not cease. What do you get from that? You ever had a Jehovah's Witness come to your door?
Once every 4 months.
I'm sorry?
Once every 4 months, they'll knock on my door.
Once every 4 months they come. What do they tell you when they come? They always have the same story. They tell us that the earth is eternal, and they'll try to go from this scripture to that scripture. They'll go all throughout the Bible telling us that the earth's going to be here forever. You're not going to go to heaven. You can't go to heaven. The heaven's already filled with 144,000, so you got to stay here on earth. That's okay, because God's going to recreate the earth, and we're going to live here and fly around like fairies and all that, and live with snakes and bears and all that for all eternity. Moses by inspiration, God says here, while the earth remains. What does that tell you? There's an implication that there's going to come a time that the earth won't be here anymore. But while it does, as long as it does, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. But there's coming a time when it won't be here anymore. And Peter talks about that. He uses the flood scenario to context anyway to bring that teaching out. But there's going to come a time when everything will be burned up, and seed time and harvest and cold and heat and winter and summer and day and night will be no longer. It'll all be gone. It's not, the earth is not eternal. So when the Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door and start telling you all that mess, just take them to Genesis 8:22 and tell them, God here says that seed time and harvest, cold, heat, winter and summer, they're going to last as long as the earth lasts. But the implication is, the teaching is that it's not going to last forever. Mentioned already, I had to hear my notes, some scholars allege that the biblical flood story borrows from the Epic of Gilgamesh. We're not going to go into that, but just know that there are other stories, flood stories. They have some similarities, but this is the one that we got from God. I'm going to stop there because we're going to go into Genesis chapter 9 next. So we'll just stop at Genesis chapter 9 and go back into it next week. Any questions? Any comments?
No.
The flood is a witness to the judgment and the grace of the living God. God was sovereign in bringing the flood. He was sovereign over the flood waters. He destroyed every living thing in which there was the breath of life through his power, through his sovereignty, using the water to accomplish that. But God is also sovereign. His sovereignty is shown, his grace is shown in the salvation of Noah. We would be wise to understand that the same God continues to watch over the course of our lives today. God is sovereign. When we look out in the world and say, oh, woe is me, look how bad it is, remember, God is in control. I am easily tempted to look out in the world and say, oh, how bad it is, because it is bad. But I just need to keep in mind that God's in control. He knows what he's doing. He knows his time. Sometimes I might want to interpret it to say, look how bad things are. We're fixing to get a judgment. That judgment could be the final judgment. It could be another, it won't be a flood, but some kind of judgment upon a nation or upon the world that will change things significantly. But we have to work on God's time frame. And as long as we have seed time and harvest, we need to be out there trying to reach the souls who are lost. Noah did it. For 120 years, he went out there and preached the gospel every day, building that ark every day, preaching the gospel every day. He did it without one convert. When the hearts of men were dark, dark, dark. We need to keep it up. Even when it looks like no one will repent, we still need to preach the gospel. Don't give up, guys. You're calling to be a preacher. If that's what you're going to be, take it seriously. Don't just be a preacher on Sunday. Be a part of the family of God, a part of the image bearers of God every day of your life. Start with your family. Go to your church, or do it in your church. Do it in your community. Do it in your nation. Preach God's grace. Preach God's judgment. Both are real. And the flood story tells us that, if nothing else. All right, we'll stop right there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your comments tonight. And I enjoyed the class. I enjoy it when you guys are talking back to me and helping me in the class. I really do.
You're welcome.
I will see you next week at 6:30.
Okie dokie.
All right, y'all have a good night.
Good night.